Welcome to week 2 of the Knitted Star Quilt Along. This week we will be cutting our fabrics. You'll notice when you look at the pattern that there are two ways to make this quilt. There's the modern version and the traditional version. The modern version uses fat quarters, and you can see there's one fat quarter for each of the stars, and the traditional version uses yardage, and it's just two colors for the entire quilt. Here's a peek at the fabric requirements found within the pattern. You'll need the pattern for any of this to make sense. If you don't already have it, you can purchase it on my website, which I will link to in the description below. So let's start with the modern version. This is a look at how you will cut up an individual fat quarter. If you look at your pattern, it has the measurements listed on the fat quarter, but for the sake of this video, I have replaced the measurements with the order that I'm going to be cutting my pieces. So first I'll start with that large piece there at the bottom left, and then I will move on from there. Go ahead and write these numbers down in your pattern so that you can refer to them as you're cutting your fabrics. So first I'm going to square up my fat quarter. I use my long ruler to make sure that the 21-inch edge is straight, and then I use a square ruler to make sure that the top right corner of my fat quarter is nice and square. So we want to make sure that there is a 90-degree angle on this corner. Then use your long ruler to trim off any excess fabric from the 18-inch edge as well to make sure that this edge is straight. Remember that you don't want to trim off too much fabric because you're going to need most of this fat quarter. Then I'm going to cut my first piece. So for this first piece, I use my long ruler, and I'm going to cover up my desired measurement. And then cut. Set this piece aside, and then I will move on to my second and third pieces. So for these next few pieces, I combine the measurements to cut one initial piece first, and then I cut that piece in half. It'll make sense when you look at your pattern. So then I'll cut this piece in half. Make sure that it measures what it needs to. Then I'll cut my next pieces. Then I'll cut piece number 6. And it looks like I need to square up my fat quarter again before I continue cutting. So I'll flip it over and create a new fresh edge. Remember to square up the top as well to keep that 90-degree angle. Then I'll cut pieces 7 and 8. And for these, I do the same thing that I did before. I'll combine the length of the two pieces to cut one initial piece, and then I will cut that piece in half. I'll do the same for pieces 9 and 10. Then I'll cut 11, 12, and 13. Then all that's left are the 5 little squares, pieces 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. And for these, I combine their measurements as well and then subcut from there. All right, so there's one fat quarter. So repeat this process for the remaining fat quarters, and then we will cut our background. When cutting from a continuous piece of yardage for either the modern or traditional version, there's a few things that you'll want to keep in mind. First, make sure that your selvages are parallel or right on top of each other. This will ensure that your fold is on grain. Sometimes fabric isn't stored on the bolt perfectly straight, so you might need to refold your fabric and iron a new crease. If you've ever cut a width of fabric strip and the area around the fold is just a little bit wonky, then it could have been, and most likely was, because the fabric wasn't folded on grain. So take the time to make sure that this is as accurate as possible, and it'll be worth it in the end. Another thing to keep in mind is to focus on one bullet point at a time. There's a lot going on in the cutting instructions table, but if you focus on each bullet point individually, then it'll make things a lot easier. Also, take note whenever you see the word each, because that means that each width of fabric strip in that bullet point needs to be cut the same way. Next, remember that it's best practice to cover your desired measurement with your ruler and to use the lines on your ruler instead of the lines on your cutting mat. This will generally give you a more accurate cut. If it's too large for a 12.5-inch square ruler, then remember that you can use your 6-inch by 24-inch ruler as well. Last but not least, accurate piecing starts with accurate cutting. Measure twice, cut once. So like I said, before I start cutting, I'm going to make sure that my fabric is folded on grain. So with this piece of fabric, the selvages are closest to me, and then the fold is furthest away from me. So I'll lift up the top piece of fabric, align the two selvages, and then push the excess fabric up towards the fold. And so this is when I would iron a new crease. When working with large cuts of fabric, sometimes it's easier to just work in sections and do it section by section, or you could do all of this at your ironing board and do the entire piece at once. Once my piece is ready to go, I will need to trim off just a little bit on the right edge of my fabric to create a fresh edge. So I will align the fold with either the top of my ruler or some lines on my ruler to make sure that it's nice and square. And then I'll cut along the right side. So like I was saying, you'll want to use the lines on your ruler instead of the lines on your cutting mat. Generally, this will give you a more accurate cut, but sometimes it's unavoidable. I'm making the modern throw size version of this pattern. If you look at the cutting instructions table, the first bullet point says 8.5 inches times width of fabric. That's a little bit too big for my ruler, so I am going to use my cutting mat. If you don't have a longer ruler, or if you don't want to use the lines on your cutting mat, then you can use your 12-inch ruler and cut this piece of fabric in two sections. For these larger cuts, when I am using the lines on my cutting mat, I always tend to give myself just a little bit of extra wiggle room, like maybe just 1/8 of an inch. So I'll line up the 1/2 inch mark on my ruler with the 8-inch line on my cutting mat. And then when I go to subcut these pieces, if my piece is a little bit larger than what I need it to be, I can easily trim it down. It's better to have just a little bit too much than a little bit too little. Then I will lay my strip horizontally on my cutting mat. And for this first cut, I'm going to use my stripology ruler, but I will show you how to cut these without a stripology ruler a little bit later on. So with this ruler, if you've never used it before, there's a dotted line on the left side and you'll want to extend your selvages past that dotted line. Then the edge of your fabric will need to line up with one of the horizontal lines in the ruler. So I have mine lined up on the black line here. You'll also want to make sure that you leave just a little bit of space in between where the slot starts and where your fabric is so that you can fit your rotary cutter in the slots. So then you'll cut on the 0. And the nice thing about the stripology ruler is that there are stars for every 1.5 inch marking. So you don't have to sit there and do math in your head and then accidentally cut the wrong thing. You just simply cut on the stars. Then you'll throw away your selvage, and you can see that I have now cut 2 pieces at a time with a single cut. Okay, moving on to the second bullet point, it says that I need 4 1.5 inch strips by width of fabric. So I'll take my long ruler and I will cover up 1.5 inches. So my left edge of fabric, I want to make sure that it comes right up to the 1.5 inch mark on my ruler. So there's my first 1.5 inch strip, and then I'm going to cut 3 more. Then for each of the 4 strips, I'm going to cut exactly what the pattern tells me to. So first I'll cut off the selvage for each strip, then I'll flip the strip over since I'm right-handed. I'll use my long ruler to cover up my desired measurement and then cut those 2 pieces. Then I'll unfold my width of fabric strip and cut the last piece. So I'll repeat this for all of the strips in that bullet point. Moving on to the third bullet point in the cutting instructions table of my pattern, I've already cut one 5.5 inch strip, and now I'm going to cut another 5.5 inch strip. Now I'm actually going to cut both of these strips at the same time. I'm going to use just a regular 24-inch ruler, not the stripology ruler, although if you do have a stripology ruler, you could use that for this. So I'm going to place my strips horizontally on my cutting mat. I'll make sure that their edges are perfectly parallel. They can overlap a little bit, or if you have enough space, you can just put them side by side. I'll cut off the selvages, then I'll use the horizontal lines on my ruler to make sure that I'm staying nice and square with my strips, and I'll cut my 1.5 inch pieces all the way down my width of fabric strips. So by doing it this way, I'm actually cutting 4 pieces at a time. Just be really careful that all of your pieces stay nice and straight, and this really saves a lot of time. So continue to cut until everything is finished, and then if you would like to, you can go ahead and label each of your pieces. I only tend to label my background pieces just since there are so many, but it's really helpful to stay organized if you kind of lay everything out based on how it's going to look within the block. For this quilt, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I am going to mix and match some of the pieces within my block so that the colors are a little bit more mixed up throughout the quilt. So it'll be really interesting to see how this turns out. Next week, for week 3 of the quilt along, we are going to start sewing some pieces together. So I will see you then.